Good evening. The 44th meeting of the 22nd Council will now come to order. Councilor Pena is excused this evening. All other councilors are present. We'll start with a moment of silence and the Pledge of Allegiance led by Councilor Sanchez.
Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Councilor Sanchez. Civic Plaza parking passes are provided for members of the public. You can obtain a parking pass from the council staff at the sign-up table. The council will take a break at approximately 7 p.m. this evening. We'll get started with the presentation from Gerald Romero, Budget Officer, regarding the latest gross receipts tax report.
Mr. President, members of the council, we received our GRT distribution for September. This was activity for August that we accrue for September. Cumulative, or the growth rate for September was actually negative 2%, so that's 2% lower than September 1 year ago. That brings the cumulative for the quarter to 1.8. So if you'll recall, July was fairly strong, 5.9%. August kind of tapered down to 1.1%, and September, unfortunately, is lower at negative 2%. So we're trending at 1.8% on an estimated budget growth of 3%.
Mr. President.
Councilor Davis.
Mr. Romero, thanks for this as always. Never know if you're here for good news or bad, or just who knows whose news this is. I wanted to make a note that I think we saw construction accounts for almost 10% of the city's sort of GRT, and we know that building permits have been strong, construction's been strong, but we actually came in under this time. Is that an analogy? Is there some TRD sort of catch up going on here? I mean, that doesn't seem to make sense to me, seeing the building permit numbers and the GRT we're seeing, or the expenditures we're seeing in that sector.
Mr. President and Councilor Davis, I'm going to let Jacques Blair come up, the city economist, and address your question.
Mr. President, Councilor Davis, what we found was last month, the construction gross receipts was down compared to the previous September, and that was an anomaly. It was due to some sort of amended return. And as you said, last year, gross receipts tax for construction was almost 50% of our growth. And there's no reason for that to stop, at least, for the next year.
And Mr. President, one last question. Jacques, just one more follow-up there. So assuming that, I know we're speculating a little here, but as we're trying to project out and be sure we're on track, assuming that's as history tells us, that's somebody's amended return, and construction gets back on track again for the remainder of the year, sort of back of the envelope tells me that we're sort of on track on our projections, determining our fluctuations, but we're still on track for positive growth over the year, even with those sort of adjustments. Is that right?
Mr. President, Councilor Davis, on Wednesday, we're going to do a presentation to the Forecast Advisory Group, and we'll put together the 5-year forecast, and we'll see if it happens there.
Okay.
We've seen some fairly weak forecasts coming out of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, so
Okay. Thanks. We'll wait on
that. We're not as optimistic as
okay.
we would hope.
Thanks.
Councilor Harris.
And while these gentlemen are up there, I'll ask a question that I didn't warn you about, but sort of interested in what's going on. I understand when the legislation for estate tax on Amazon was pending, I think Amazon started actually collecting it, but I heard it, then they stopped. Do you know what's going on with internet sales and how that affects our budget right now?
Mr. President, Councilor Harris, what's the Amazon, they made a contract with the state, an agreement to collect gross receipts. They're collecting it on everything that's on the, that Amazon sells itself through its warehouses. And it is currently taxed at the state rate of 5 1/8 cents, rather, so it is not distributed to the cities and counties. There is talk, and it seems that Amazon may go ahead and start taxing everybody that's on their platform, or paying taxes for everybody that's on their platform. Hopefully, you know, this is just a hope. During this session, they'll do something that will put those taxes so they'll be at different cities and counties' rates and distribute the money. But that's something we can't bank on at this point.
And Mr. President? And thank you, Mr. Blair. Or is it Dr. Blair? I forget.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, Dr. Blair, is there any policy reason not to include the municipalities in this? And also, there's a municipal gross receipts tax that's even part of the 5%. Are we getting that?
Mr. President, Councilor Harris, there's a gross receipts tax and a compensating tax at both at just the state level. And right now, not only Amazon, but as I was surprised to find, buying something from REI, if they deliver it to your house, they charge you the 5 1/8. So we're some of these sales, it's not real clear what it is. The policy decision was made because basically when they made that, for out-of-state firms, that's the only authority that they had for charging them when they were out of state. Now they have Nexus because they bought Whole Foods. How that figures out due to their structure of the company and everything, you know, we'll find out over the years. So hopefully we'll get some more money, but we don't know.
Yeah, it just seems, and I'll make a political pitch, that, I mean, the municipality is really being treated unfairly, because not only did they pass the hold harmless, where they're actually taking money from us every year, but then they reach agreements which intentionally discriminate against the cities. So I just hope that we can get that message loud and clear to our legislators and others, that this is really discriminates against local business, because they're paying whatever the tax rate is. And then these big multinational corporations, I mean, everyone's supposed to like small business, but we're enacting tax policy that discriminates against small business. And I just hope we can somehow get that fixed.
Any other questions? Councilor Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have one question regarding Councilor Benton. I think when you first took the presidency of the council, you sent a letter out to the state of New Mexico regarding the calculations, if they were calculating the gross receipts taxes properly. Did we ever get a response back from Taxation and Revenue regarding Council President Benton's issue?
Mr. President, Councilor Sanchez, I have not seen a response. I would think it would come to back to the councilors, so.
Yeah, the letter was sent to the state auditor, and the state auditor did weigh in and request that that analysis and possible correction, but I don't think we've received anything from Tax and Rev.
And I have one more quick question for Mr. Romero. You stated the projected revenues for this fiscal year were 3.2%. Right now, we are at 1.8%.
Mr. President, Councilor Sanchez, the current projection for growth in gross receipts is 3.0, and we're trending at 1.8. And we'll see, after looking at the data Mr. Blair presents on Wednesday to the committee, what the 5-year forecast revision for 18 will be. But I'm going to guess we're going to be something lower than 3%.
So the projected shortfalls would be in terms of dollars based on these figures. about 3.2 million, 3.3 million?
Mr. President, Councilor Sanchez, yes, in round numbers. The good news here is that, if you'll recall, as we were heading towards the end of FY17, we noticed GRT was trending downward, and so we put in place an austerity plan with regard to expenditures, and preliminarily, we don't have the general fund finished through the external auditor's review yet, but it does look like we covered the shortfall for FY17, and that we will be carrying forward additional reversions into 18. And we have a cleanup bill that was introduced. It's on the letter of introduction today for discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to the administration question and answer period. Councilors, any questions for the administration? Seeing none, we'll move on to the journal. Vice President Winter.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move approval of the October 16th journal.
There's a motion and a second to approve the October 16th journal. All those in favor say yes?
Yes.
Yes, opposed, and that passes. We'll move to communications and introductions. Are there any changes to the letter of introduction? I do have a couple myself. I move the rules be suspended for the purpose of placing EC 463 on tonight's agenda for final action. EC 463 is approval of a real estate agreement between the City of Albuquerque and the City of Las Cruces for approximately 113 acres in Doña Ana County.
Second.
There's a motion and a second. This requires a 2/3 vote. All those in favor say yes?
Yes.
Yeah. Opposed? And that passes. I will also move the rules be suspended for the purpose of placing R-253 on tonight's agenda for final action. R-253 is approving and authorizing the acceptance of a U.S. Department of Justice grant agreement for a comprehensive opioid abuse site-based program and providing an appropriation to the Department of Family and Community Services. There's a motion and a second. All those in favor say yes?
Yes.
Opposed? And that passes. Vice President Winter.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move approval of the letter of introduction.
There's a motion and a second to approve the letter of introduction. All those in favor say yes?
Yes.
Opposed? And that passes. We have no committee reports tonight. We'll move on to deferrals and withdrawals. Councilors, any deferrals or withdrawals at this time? Vice President Winter.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is Committee Substitute R-242, establishing a major investment study initiative for Alameda Boulevard between Jefferson Avenue and Coors Boulevard. Move deferral until November 20th.
There's a motion and a second to defer Committee Substitute R-242 until November 20th. All those in favor say yes?
Yes.
Opposed? And that passes. We'll now move to the consent agenda. Are there any changes to the consent agenda?
Mr. President,
Councilor Davis.
I'd like to remove items C and D as they relate to each other. We can talk about them together.
Okay. And we do have a speaker on one of the items, so I'm not going to remove that item, but I'm going to ask that speaker to come up if she's prepared to speak on, this is on EC 17428, Holly Barnett Sanchez. Holly?
Good evening, President Benton and members. Whoa. President Benton and members of the City Council. I am speaking this evening because this proposed fresco project by Frederico Vigil is something of potentially great importance for the City of Albuquerque and for the Convention Center. As a retired professor whose specialty is the history of muralism and fresco art in the United States, Frederico Vigil is a person of international prominence. It will provide, the proposed fresco will provide a destination for people who are interested in the history of fresco art. He has frescoes already at the Torreon and in Albuquerque, Spain, that we provided by the city, and it will contribute to a long and venerable history of fresco painting in the United States. So I just speak in support of that.
Thanks for coming down and taking the time. You know, it's nice to have such a renowned artist, and of course, the council pitched in and helped with the work of art, and Councilor Gibson, I believe, might want to speak to that. But that was in Albuquerque, yes, in our namesake city in Spain, and that was. I'd love to see that someday.
We were
I'm
there
sure.
for the dedication. It's a beautiful fresco that brings our two cities together.
Councilor Gibson.
Thank you, and thank you for being here this evening. I read with great interest the EC that appears on tonight's agenda, and I'm curious when you think that he may begin this project.
That's not within my my frame of expertise. The office, the Public Arts Office can speak to that.
Okay.
Director Feldman.
Good evening, councilors, President Benton and Councilor Gibson. He's ready to start as soon as the approval is given.
Great, good news. Thank you so much.
All right, so we're back on the consent agenda with the exception of items C and D. Vice President Winter.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move approval of the consent agenda.
There's a motion and a second. All those in favor say yes. Yes. Opposed? And that passes. We'll move to items C and D from the consent agenda. Councilor Davis, EC 17-417 and EC 17-418.
Thank you, Mr. President. We can take both of these. I think they're both the same question. I'm going to put to Mr. Perry. Maybe we table this until Mr. Hernandez can join us. But in our review of these items, these are approvals of outside legal contracts with two different legal groups. However, we noted that the contract, the performance options in the staff write-ups say that these contracts could be extended for a total of almost 5 years, which is longer than any contract I can remember us doing, even for legal services. Mr. Perry, do you know why we've chosen that option here, or perhaps we should table this until Mr. Hernandez can come back with the details?
Mr. President, Councilor, I think we probably should table it. I just point out that as it relates to EC 17-417, the Garcia contract, it is runs through June 2018 and has two possible 2-year extensions. And I can't tell you anything more than that. So I think the city attorney will have to advise on the rationale for that.
Thanks. And Mr. Perry, just to be clear, we're not in a hurry on this one, so we could, like, we need to resolve it tonight if we can, but we could push it until we could answer that. I believe there's.
It's my understanding, yes, sir.
Mr. President, I make a motion just to table, I guess we do them one at a time, 17-417 until later in the meeting.
All right, there's a motion and a second to table EC 17-417. All those in favor say yes. Yes. Opposed? That passes.
Thank you. Mr. President, I make a motion to table EC 17-418.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Opposed? And that passes. We'll now move to final actions. And items A, B, and C all relate to the Integrated Development Ordinance. Therefore, they will be discussed together. We'll start with council staff giving us a brief introduction.
Good evening, Mr. President and councillors. This is O1749 and R17213. The second hearing by the full City Council on the adopting ordinance and resolution for the proposed Integrated Development Ordinance, commonly referred to as the IDO. The IDO was introduced to City Council on June 19th and has had 4 hearings with the Land Use Planning and Zoning Subcommittee of the Council. Through the Land Use Planning and Zoning process, 31 amendments to the IDO were passed. The first hearing on the IDO by the full City Council was held on October 16th. Tonight we will be discussing 19 specific amendments. I will be going through a short present summary on each amendment tonight, labeled A through S. Packets for the public containing each amendment are available at the sign-up table. Councilors, you have this packet in front of you as well. During this presentation, please feel free to stop me with any questions or if you need clarification on any of the amendments. This summary will be followed by public comment. First up is Amendment A, Residential Development. This amendment seeks to support the long-term goal of enabling unique infill development while diversifying the city's supply of affordable housing. This amendment revises the minimum acreage for campground or RV park and increases the maximum density. The amendment also revises definitions related to campground and recreational vehicle. This amendment was presented at the October 16th City Council meeting and has been revised to separate out the different aspects of the amendment. Amendments B, K, and R all address standing. I'm going to present these amendments out of order as they are on a related topic. The zoning code today provides standing to residents and neighborhood associations based on 2 things: showing harm and proximity. The IDO does not change an individual or neighborhood association's ability to appeal a decision based on harm. This means that if someone is harmed by a decision, no matter their proximity to the site, they can appeal. The 3 amendments discussing standing deal not with harm, but with proximity. As drafted, the IDO proposes to reduce the distance for standing based merely on proximity for some decisions. Amendments B, R, and K focus on this aspect of standing. Amendments B and R are 2 variations on the amendment presented at the October 16th Council meeting. Amendment B, this amendment provides a table showing the different standing distances. The differences between the distances reflect the potential impact of the decision. More minor decisions have a lesser standing distance, while more major decisions have a greater distance. Amendment R, standing 2, this amendment is very similar to Amendment B, except that the table in this amendment reflects the distances for standing that are in the zoning code today. This does not reflect the different scale of decisions, but it does carry over the appeal standing per the zoning code today. And Amendment K, increased standing, this amendment is specific to large retail facilities. This would increase the standing for neighborhood associations for appeals of large retail facilities over 50,000 square feet to a half mile. This reflects the potential greater impact such developments could have on surrounding areas. This amendment does not reflect current standing distances. These are the only amendments before you tonight that address standing. And returning to the order in the packets, Amendment K, neighborhood meetings. This amendment provides greater detail for the process for neighborhood notification, neighborhood meetings, and facilitated meetings. Sections 1 and 4 address the notification process. Section 2 addresses the required pre-application neighborhood meeting, and Section 3 addresses the facilitated meeting. Overall, the IDO seeks to ensure that neighborhoods are involved in the development process earlier rather than later, so that any concerns the neighbors may have can be integrated into the proposed development early on, rather than later in the process. The IDO seeks to create a collaborative process between the neighborhood and the development community. Amendment D, community residential facilities and group homes. The zoning code today regulates community residential programs by size with a distance separation and a cap per council district. The zoning code does not differentiate between programs for those considered a federally protected class per the Fair Housing Act, and those not protected. The IDO separates this one use into two uses: those who are federally protected, i.e. a community residential facility, and those not federally protected, i.e. a group home. The IDO also regulates by size. Generally, community residential facilities are mapped where there is a single-family residential use, while group homes are mapped where there is multifamily. The IDO carries over the distance separation and distance cap for group homes only. This amendment would extend the distance separation and the district cap to the community residential facilities as well. Amendment E, requiring a mix of uses. This amendment would require development of properties with mixed-use zoning located on the west side of Albuquerque, i.e. those with MXT, MXL, MXM, and MXH zoning, to include a commercial component. This seeks to address the jobs housing imbalance and to ensure that development of mixed-use zoning doesn't result in purely residential development. Amendment F, manufacturing. This amendment revises the amount that a non-conforming use or structure can expand by before it must come into compliance with the standards of the IDO. This reflects the standards in the zoning code today. This amendment also reduces the distance between a heavy manufacturing use and a residence, school, or church from 1,000 feet to 660 feet. 1,000 feet is roughly equivalent to 3 blocks, while 660 feet is roughly equivalent to 2 blocks. And finally, this amendment reduces the parking minimum for heavy manufacturing uses. Heavy manufacturing often requires large structures, but are not necessarily staffed by a large number of people. Amendments G, building and site design. This amendment requires a 50-foot separation distance between a residence and car wash building and any outdoor associated uses for the car wash. This is similar to the language for drive-throughs that require the order board to be located 50 feet from a residence. In all cases, the separation distance recognizes the potential audible impact from the use and the required site layout, and requires the site layout to consider the impact on adjacent residents. This amendment also lowers the threshold for the provision of outdoor seating areas to be in line with the requirements in the zoning code today. Amendment H, usable open space. This amendment revises the use-specific standard for cottage and co-housing, clarifying that in the RA zone, usable open space does not include balconies and roof decks. This is appropriate as these features, these are features that are more appropriate in an urban setting than in a rural setting. Amendment I, sawmill residential. This amendment revises the conversion for the sawmill residential zone from R1B to R1A. This better reflects the entitlements in the sawmill residential zone. The sawmill residential zone allows 2 units on lots 7,000 square feet and larger. The units may be attached or detached. The R1B has a minimum lot size of 7,000 square feet, while the R1A has a minimum lot size of 3,500 square feet. The amendment also adds a mapped area for accessory dwelling units on lots 7,000 square feet and greater, reflecting the allowances of the sawmill residential zone today. Amendment J, walls and fences. This amendment revises the previous amendment passed during LUPS, Amendment Q, that addressed walls and fences. This amendment adds corner lots, per the zoning code today, makes clerical edits to terms, and adds language that requires there to be 20% of the parcels within 330 feet of a proposed wall or fence to also have a wall over 3 feet in height. Amendment L, PD zone. This amendment seeks to remove the minimum acreage for the PD zone in order to provide greater flexibility for application of this zone. This amendment retains the maximum acreage, which is less than 20 acres, i.e. 19.999 acres. While this amendment seeks to provide flexibility, There is concern that such flexibility could be abused in the future. Amendment M, the Edo Character Protection Overlay, or CPO. This amendment revises the Edo CPO to remove architectural standards that were added to the Edo regulatory plan but were found to be difficult to interpret and enforce. The amendment does not impact the Edo historic properties. Edo is broken into two parts. The historic properties are mapped in the Edo Historic Protection Overlay Zone, HPO, and the rest is mapped as the Character Protection Overlay Zone, the CPO. Amendment N. This amendment is not to the exhibit, but rather to the ordinance. This is the effective period. This amendment clarifies the process for amendments to the IDO during the effective period. During the 6-month effective period, amendments to the IDO can be introduced directly to City Council for the council process. This would ensure that necessary changes to the document that are identified during the educational and training process can be addressed before the document goes into effect. Amendment O, artisan manufacturing. This amendment proposes to make artisan manufacturing a conditional use in the MXT zone and to revise the definition to reflect changes in technology. Artisan manufacturing is a new use in the IDO that reflects the growing trend in small-scale manufacturing. Amendment P, master development plans. This amendment is technical in nature and provides a process for approval of master development plans in the non-residential business park zone. This amendment provides clarity for the master development plan approval process. Amendment Q, cottage and co-housing. This amendment combines cottage and co-housing into one use under the name of cottage housing. Both uses result in a very similar built form. The maximum dwelling unit size for cottage is continued, while the option for a communal building is carried over from the co-housing. A minimum unit size is added to the RA and R1 zones, and the 30% usable open space is applied to both zones, recognizing the lower density residential character of these zones. This amendment incorporates previous amendments to cottage and co-housing uses. And Amendment S, technical edits. This amendment proposes a number of changes to the IDO that are technical in nature and non-substantive. Ongoing staff review and response to public comments identified a number of technical revisions that will make the draft clearer and easier to use and administer. This is a general cleanup of the document. Attached to the amendments is a spreadsheet that identifies the proposed edits. There are multiple line items in this amendment, and in general, each item is unrelated to others. If there are any items within the spreadsheet attached to the amendment that a councillor would like further discussion on, that item or items can be removed and treated as a standalone amendment. This amendment is in addition to Amendment W during the LUPS process. And councillors, with that, that is my summary of the amendments before us this evening.
Councilors, any questions for staff at this time? Councilor Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. President. So thank you for that. Maybe I should have stopped you very early on because the three amendments that we have in standing, it looks like they're just the two of them that conflict. Is that correct? B and R, I believe?
Mr. President, Councillor Gibson, yes, that's correct. Amendments B and R are essentially the same, except that they have different tables. Amendment B, the table is based on the impact of the decision, so the scale of the decision. The greater the impact, the greater the distance required, whereas amendments R, the table reflects the distances today per the zoning code. Amendment K is a little bit different in that it is very specific to a particular type of use. But they are all about standing.
So what happens if we pass both?
both B and R.
Right.
That would be a conflict.
Don't do that. I'm not going to do that. But she might. Well, you know what? We can burn that bridge when we get to it. It just,
Mr. President, Councilor Gibson, we'd hope that wouldn't happen.
okay, thank you.
All right, any other questions for staff? All right, Councilor Jones? Okay, thanks. So we're going to move on to public comment on all three of the bills, O-1749, R-17-213, and R-17-240. And we'll call out three names at a time so that the people who are on deck can come up and sit in the front row and be ready to go. The first three speakers are Don Schrader, Carol Kraus, and E. Ward.
I oppose the integrative development ordinance. What percentage of Albuquerque adults have even heard of the IDO? How many know what specific long-term changes it will bring to their neighborhoods? How many in-depth articles have appeared in the Albuquerque Journal or the Alibi? How many city officials pushing the IDO will personally make big bucks if the IDO is approved? How many city officials have developer friends who will make big bucks? Especially for the San Jose neighborhood that has suffered so much from horrible polluting companies, does the IDO offer any strong protection from pollution? Given the horrendous pollution in San Jose, would any of you 9 councilors want to live or have any of your family live in San Jose? Why were so many meetings on the IDO scheduled in the daytime when many low-income people are working? How much outreach to those people who speak only or primarily Spanish? I strongly compliment candidate Tim Keller for opposing the IDO.
Is Carol Kraus, then E. Ward, and then Robert Nelson.
Mr. President, councilors, there has been decades of fighting and contention over zoning that was done back in 1959 to our community. It was unfair then, and it is just as unfair now to try and change it back to residential only now. This is just one huge reason why this IDO is so important to our community. The IDO's commitment to voluntary downzoning in these contentious areas is as close to fair and equitable solution to the wrong that was done so many years ago. Our current sector plan has virtually no enforceable protections, and the proposed sector plans of 2010 and 12 that did not pass for good reason tries to right one wrong by doing another. Those that say they want this community to go back to the way it was have forgotten the small businesses that made it a self-contained village many years ago. Our small businesses have been driven out or prevented from starting, creating a total desert where it comes to the necessities a community needs in foods and services. This IDO offers countless protections that we have listed so many times before, so I will not go over them again. I will just say, please vote to pass the IDO and spare our small community more unnecessary years of fighting, intimidation, and contention. Please pass the IDO and give us peace so we can come together as a community again as we once were. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Ms. Ward, followed by Mr. Nelson, and then Jerry Worrell.
couldn't find the microphone. Mr. President, councilors, the current amendment packet needs to be pointed out that the packet was not available online until Saturday night, a little after 8 o'clock. The links that were sent in the email went to the amendment packet to the March amendments for the comp plan back in March 2017. Directly on the website, it didn't go until after 8 o'clock. This was tried on multiple computers multiple times. Regarding amendments B, K, and R, they do not include language to exclude rights of way in the distance measurements. This language should be explicit. Amendment B clearly intends to reduce public participation. Amendment R should be the preferred amendment with or without modest distance increases for consistency with other distance limits in the proposed IDO. Amendment N removes the EPC from the normal zone change process, further reducing public participation. The Wiscona amendments regarding density and height maxima are not included in the packet. Bring our amendments to public discussion and a vote. Please defer a decision for 90 days. And one of the reasons we need to really pay attention to the height and the density is you can see that there seems to be just some arbitrariness or willy-nilliness to these increases. As you'll see, the words of the planning department are, it would be good to have some, excuse me, I have to read it. It would be good to have some evidence that one-story retail needs 30 feet. And please, I'd like this entered into the record, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next is Mr. Nelson, then Mr. Worrell, then Gary Eister.
Good evening, Council. Council President Benton, thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight on behalf of our neighborhoods. My name is Robert Nelson. I am on the board for Wells Park Neighborhood Association and a member of the Historic Neighborhoods Alliance. Wells Park wishes to reiterate its continued opposition to the IDO, wishing it deferred so that equitable engagement can occur with communities of color like our neighbors in Santa Barbara, Martineztown, and Sawmill. As a member of the HNA, we continue to advocate for the equitable engagement of communities of color. For too long, these communities have been subject to the priorities of economic development at the hands of city officials and wealthy developers. That the IDO is done at the service of capital, thus displacing cultures and multitudes of families, all the while being told it's good for us and good for Albuquerque. The IDO has been inequitable throughout the beginning. There was not adequate representation of our diverse communities throughout the planning process. Over 65% of the planning participants were white, non-Hispanic. Less than 15% were Hispanic, Chicano, or Latino, and only 1% were Native American. In a community where there is a rising majority, these types of public projects need input from all of its community members, not just those whom are white. And I look upon our council tonight and see this very lack of representation and hope that we can do better. Perhaps we would be better served with more equitable practices throughout the government, from distribution of resources to policies and procedures, even to the way our government communicates with the public. Equity throughout government would shift our mindsets from scarcity to asset orientation, but the truth is communities of color are not seen as assets in our community. We are subject to disinvestment, we are seen as barriers, and yet we have so much to offer in regards to our traditions and our culture and our history. These bridge our oppression and carry us into the future. We ask that the IDO be deferred until after the election of our new mayor so that all of our community can give input that has impact, and that we want community assessments conducted with neighborhoods before approval of this document, and that city councilors along with planning and the ONC undergo undoing racism training specific to the history of Albuquerque. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Worrell. Please no applause. Mr. Worrell, Gary Eister, and then Loretta Naranjo Lopez.
Good evening, councilors. I'm Jerry Worrell, president of the West Side Coalition of Neighborhood Associations, those 25 neighborhoods that belong to the coalition. We held a press release, or issued a press release this morning at Taylor Ranch Community Center, followed by a press conference. And what the purpose of this is to reveal to you and to the general public two documents that I would like to pass on to you. One is the July 16, 2013 Consolidated Roundtable Notes of the Planning Department, and in a brainstorming session of January 3rd, 2014. And we have highlighted some of the items on there that we wish you to take a look at. So I'll give those to you. The excerpts identify in there what our major concern is removing neighborhood and homeowner associations from the process of vetting these programs and what's going to be done in the development. But I think more importantly, which reaches across the river, the redevelopment of the city of Albuquerque. Now, the resolution that we passed asking for a 90-day extension deferral before approval of this is based on these documents, and the executive committee of the coalition, because of the timing of meetings and other things, took it to the inter-coalition panel, which also passed it unanimously with a quorum present, and the Wisconsin resolution passed at our last meeting, and it's asking for that 90-day referral. So there are a number of things in there. I will leave the resolution with you, and along with another document which identifies even more problematic issues that we won't have time because I have 10 seconds left of that. So developers get hours and days to do this. I get 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks. Next speaker. We will not allow applause in the chambers tonight. If you wish to applaud, you can go out in the lobby. We'll have you escorted out. All right, next is Gary Eister, followed by Loretta Naranjo Lopez, followed by Terry Spiat.
Thanks, Mr. President and councilors. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the constant commitment to hard work and professional work that we've gotten from city planning for these last 2 years. I'd like to recognize their sustained commitment to the principles of planning and to our community. On behalf of countless colleagues in many neighborhoods, thank you, Councilor Davis, Councilor Benton, for sponsoring Amendment J, which will carry forward an existing public process for review of walls over 3 feet and front setbacks. Amendment J is a credit to policy making that is consistent or responsive to community input. Thank you to Petra and Shanna for their expert development and refinement of the amendment. Amendment J refines Amendment Q, which the LUPS passed forward, which will continue the process giving communities a voice in the form of their streetscapes. Amendment J is balanced. It addresses the architectural nature of all the communities, all the neighborhoods in Albuquerque. And as much as anything, Amendment J preserves eyes on the street. It's a no-cost way for council to lower crime and to increase community connection. Additionally, it'll give mid-century neighborhoods all over Albuquerque a chance for historic listing, unlocking New Mexico's 50% tax credit for homeowners and fostering stability. Along with a great many in Nob Hill, in Highland, in Southeast Heights, Silver Hill, Inez, and others, I urge you to adopt Amendment J.
Thank you.
Mr. President, may I brief?
Councilor Davis.
Mr. Eister, I just want to address that really quickly and just ask. I want to say, I know we've, the neighborhood associations that have been working in this particular Amendment J and several others, as you mentioned, J is an amendment to the old Q, and I think it's been a development from a lot of members from our neighborhood associations who've weighed in for years on these pieces. And can you remind me how many different meetings, perhaps roughly, that you, your neighborhood association, or this working group has had about various amendments in this? Y'all have put in a tremendous amount of work here too, and I want to acknowledge some of that in terms of how this process came together.
Yes, Councilor. Well, I recall a number of study sessions that we had with planning staff, probably 4 or 5 with Nob Hill at various times. And as far as the amendment process, I suppose we've had a good dozen meetings among the neighborhood associations and with you and your analyst, and with one another.
Thank you, Mr. Archer. And Mr. President, I just want to point out, I think that's part of this process has been to acknowledge that the years of work our neighborhoods have put in and worked hard. And we haven't always gotten 100% on these amendments for what everybody wanted, but the folks who've continued to give feedback have given us amendment to amendment to amendment here. And I think that's important as we go into these debates tonight to remember how much community input has also gone into this, in addition to planning staff who get paid to do it. So thank you to our neighborhoods who showed up tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Loretta Naranjo Lopez, then Terry Spiak, then Sean Gilligan.
Good evening, Councilor Benton, President Benton, and councilors. My name is Loretta Naranjo Lopez, and I'm the president of the Santa Barbara Martinez-Town Neighborhood Association, a member of the Martinez-Town Work Group, and a leader with the Historic Neighborhood Alliance. Prior to the approval of the Integrated Development Ordinance, the Santa Barbara Martinez-Town Neighborhood Association requests that the City of Albuquerque correct the zoning error for the historical Martinez-Town Santa Barbara residential land use area. The City of Albuquerque should review all residential land uses recorded in the Bernalillo County Tax Assessor's Office and shall zone the residential land use R1 zone for the Martinez-Town Santa Barbara area boundary. Any commercial land uses that want to remain commercial shall come into conformance with the current commercial requirements, pay commercial taxes, and individually request their commercial zone requests through the City Planning Department. All properties that are residential land use and are paying commercial property taxes can request that their properties shall be zoned R1 and request the change of zone in order to pay residential taxes. The Integrated Development Ordinance is recommending that our properties will be non-conforming. These are historical residential land uses, single-family dwellings that have been there since the 1800s, and we have always paid our taxes. And so we're requesting that you respect that we be allowed to continue our single-family, which is allowed in the current zoning. I thank you for the opportunity, and I hope that you will consider deferring this. This is a very serious matter. This is law that you're placing for the City of Albuquerque, and it will impact us for the future. And I'm asking that you give us some time to really look at this. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Ms. Spiak, then Sean Gilligan, and then Jim Weibel.
Councilor President Benton and fellow city councilors, my name is Terry Spiak. I'm with Taylor Ranch Neighborhood Association, serving as the current president. I would like to ask that the documents that Mr. Worrell asked to be entered into the record be taken and entered into the record because they're still sitting here. I have another document that needs to be entered into the record, and this document is a collection of emails, and it also contains information from the City Council resolution that was passed in April of 2014, where it estimated and stated that this entire project, ABC to Z project, which includes the IDO under consideration this evening, would kick off in October 2014. And it estimated that there would be 3 to 4 years necessary in order to complete the process. And so, in actuality, the project did not kick off until February 2015. So the 3-year point would not be until February of 2018, and the 4-year would go into 2019. So we have always felt that due to the very extreme complexity of the documents, the actual weight and size of the document, you can tell that it's a very difficult document to wade through. You have to go back and forth from section to section. It's not really easily organized to be able to even formulate what you want to say from a neighborhood perspective. And so we ask that you do defer the voting on this and try to understand that haste is not going to get us where we want to be. We want to be in agreement between planning staff and neighborhoods, and we want cohesive working relationships between city planning, city council, EPC, and the neighborhoods. And so in order to achieve this best possible end result, we ask that you defer the project for 90 days. Thank you.
Next is Mr. Gilligan, then Mr. Weibel, then Keith Meyer.
Mr. President, councilors, my name is Sean Gilligan, and I'm
owner of Snap Home, and we do small infill projects, and primarily in the downtown area. And I'm speaking in favor of IDO, and specifically those portions of it that can allow a kind of mixed income, smaller housing units in typical single-family housing areas. I have typically worked in close-in neighborhoods and believe strongly in this. And it's interesting because if you look at a lot of the close-in neighborhoods to downtown, Huning Garden or Huning Highlands and the DNA, they have a lot of these things. They have single-family houses, they have courtyard apartments, they have carriage houses, and they have a small neighborhood commercial. And I think that that is, in a lot of ways, a better way to go than a monoculture. It wasn't only late, it was later in the 50s that we ending up with, you know, single monoculture type developments with all houses being the same size. In my mind, this diversity is good for everyone. It more closely mirrors the makeup of the city and allows for different types of people to live in a rural area. I have been building small-scale units for 15 years and have been living in small spaces myself during that time. My partner and I currently live in one of the homes that we recently completed on Iron. It is 850 square feet, 2-bedroom, 1-bath, and we love it. Large lot subdivisions force builders to build larger homes and denies the ability of buyers who either can't afford or don't want large single-family houses from living in areas that are zoned for low density. Small is what people are starting to look for, and the IDO seems to help with creating more opportunity for that. A lot of people want to stay in their homes but want to downsize or right-size to something that's more appropriate to them. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Weibel, then Mr. Meyer, and then Dave Hill.
Mr. President, councilors, I'm Jim Weibel. I'm a commercial real estate broker at NAI Estes and Ward. I'm also the immediate past president of the Commercial Association of Realtors. I'd like to thank you again for your consideration of the IDO and the staff's work that they've put into this large project. We really appreciate the time and effort they've put into that. I just want to take a step back and talk about the original reason that or some of the original reasons that we've gone down this process is to simplify and make more predictable the policy around land use and ultimately, hopefully, get more capital coming into our economy. And I think the IDO does a good job of heading down that path. With regard to Amendment B, you're trying to recognize that the complexity of the decision varies with the type of the decision, and I think that's a good thing overall. I think that you should consider possibly collapsing some of the categories in internal administrative to have a specific distance, and then in terms of notification, then possibly public hearing having a slightly greater distance in terms of notification. And then policy obviously stands on itself because many times it affects the whole city or it may just affect a certain area. In either case, I think the neighborhood association distance that's mentioned in there should be pretty uniform as either within or adjacent to the area that's being considered. Also like to request that you consider straight no vote on amendments C, K, and R. I don't think that those do anything to help the IDO or the overall process. And then lastly, would encourage your yes vote on the IDO in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next is Mr. Hill, or excuse me, Mr. Meyer, then Mr. Hill, and then Karen Cathy.
Commissioner Benton, councilors, again, my name is Keith Meyer. I am the president of SIR, that's the Society of Industrial and Office Realtors, and I'm a past board member for NAIOP. And I would like to also voice my support overall for the IDO. Specifically, I'd like to talk tonight about 3 of the proposed amendments, amendments E, K, and R. On Amendment E, it stipulates here that commercial zoning or uses will be required at least 50% of the ground floor area. And I would ask that basically that the councilors trust the market. Believe me, if there's an opportunity for commercial development, the owner or the developer of that property is absolutely going to try to make a commercial because they get the highest return, that they can pay the highest land price. So I understand that we're trying to encourage, there are some who are trying to encourage more commercial development on the west side of the river, but the issues with the west side of the river don't relate to available zoning or available opportunity. They relate to a myriad of factors. The good news is there's absolutely growth in commercial on the west side, but a lot of the problems are inherent in something as simple as access. If you really want to create more retail on the west side of town, make the access better, the curb cuts better, and allow more median breaks, because that's really what the retailers are struggling with. But I think just to mandate a certain amount of commercial development on each project is forcing the market and not helpful. I should mention that I do represent as a retail broker Sprouts, Circle K, McDonald's, Applebee's, O'Reilly Auto Parts, and others. So I've had opportunity to work with these retailers. I know what they're looking for. That speaks to K. I will tell you it's the most dynamic time in retail real estate right now, very exciting time. But every retailer's due to the Amazon effect is rethinking everything they do with regards to the retail presentation. And so I can tell you, I think the 50,000 square foot is just an arbitrary number. My advocacy would that you do not include it because every retailer, again, is going to have a different size. I can tell you, as an example, Smith's is currently on hold on all projects, but the next Smith's you see will have a drive-through to
Thank
it.
you,
So,
Mr.
thank you.
Meyer. Next, there's a question? Okay. Next speaker is Dave Hill, followed by Karen Cathy, and then Nick.
Good evening, councilors. I've been here several times. I'm Dave Hill with Commercial Realtor. I've been in the business for 20 years. First of all, I want to thank staff and the council here taking on this monumental task. The original zoning was passed over 50 years ago in the 70s, and it's time to update it. And the whole idea of good zoning process is to have predictability and protection. You've always heard some neighborhoods talking about the protection, and the IDO, as it was passed out of LUPS, does just that. It protects the neighborhoods. But what it also does is gives us an ability to develop the city. A city is going to grow. Whether you want it to grow or not, it's going to grow. And the whole idea of the IDO is to grow with predictability. Have something that's developed that we're all proud of. We have a very diverse city in Albuquerque. And it's one that all of us are very proud of. And there's different reasons to be proud of the city. Some of the neighborhoods have some dynamic issues. And I think the IDO, as it was passed out of LUPS, protected those neighborhoods. So I ask you to pass and move forward the IDO. I do think on our Amendment C, where you have a notation on recognized associations and non-recognized associations, is a little ambiguous. As in the development process, we need predictability. You have the ONC that has recognized neighborhoods. Give those recognized neighborhoods the ability to talk to the developers and the process. Give the developers a predictability. I encourage you to get this IDO passed, move forward, and I look forward to working with you guys more in the future.
Thank you. Next is Karen Cathy, followed by Nick, and then Ron Casillas.
Is it on the screen? All right, so I placed on here on the screen, it is the City of Albuquerque Housing and Community Development Survey. It's in English and Spanish as far as I know. And please, those in the audience and those watching the government station, please go and fill one out because November 30th is coming soon. And on the survey, the last time it was done, valid surveys were 750 in English, 36 in Spanish, 3 in Chinese, 7 in Vietnamese, and the total was 796 valid surveys. We need to increase that. We need to have Navajo, Dene. We need to have enough of the other languages. Also, I live in the International District, so that is very important. And I thank Benton, Gibson, and Sanchez for being at the Tiny Village presentation. I don't know if any of the other counselors have been there, were there too, but those are the ones that I saw. Thank you. And Sanchez, thank you so much for item C. I appreciate that. And you did say something, Councilor Davis, those who get paid to do it, they get to meet a lot and get those people out. That's the difference. They get paid to do it, and some of us don't. So I'm proposing not to pass the IDO. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Nick, followed by Ron Casillas, followed by Jim Strozier.
Council President, councilors, quickly please allow me to apologize about my inability to stay tonight for the length of this meeting, especially in regards to the criticality of the IDO and our support of its prompt passing. This has been a long and arduous process for the city, the planning department, all organizations and representatives that spoke on behalf of a number of their constituents or lack thereof. In our case, first as the board of the Santa Barbara Martineztown Neighborhood Association, and then as the re-energized board of Semillas y Raíces, we have labored to inform our neighbors of the upcoming changes proposed by the IDO and its amendments, if passed, of course, for the past 2 years. Informing our neighbors was paramount. We created a varied platform for information dissemination, monthly meetings, distribution of flyers, our website, postings on Nextdoor, and other activities. And most importantly, face-to-face conversations. These are the moments we could best gauge the amount and quality of work in front of our group and how much we had already achieved. The two biggest obstacles that we met were, one, how divided our community stood, this starting decades ago, and how stifling it still is to any progress in our community. And two, although there was a lot of interest, hope, and thankfulness for our work, just how uninvolved our people remained. Very busy schedules, lack of trust, and a good amount of fear. It is in that atmosphere, and in spite of it, that we labored to instruct ourselves, share that knowledge, and then be in full support of the comp plan and the ensuing IDO and its amendment in front of us today. With the understanding, one, that the city and our historical and relegated neighborhood will work together to ensure that we continue to hear from each and every segment of our community, and two, that the IDO and more specifically the character protection overlay be updated and amended as information and a better understanding are garnered through the community assessment program. This neighborhood does not want a repeat of the past. For the current and future members of our very unique community, we want both to revitalize and recreate our village within the city of Albuquerque. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Casillas, followed by Jim Strozier, and then Lynn Anderson. I don't see Mr. Casillas, so our next speaker would be Jim Strozier, followed by Lynn Anderson, followed by Sal Perdomo.
Thank you. Mr. President, councilors, my name is Jim Strozier, principal with Consensus Planning. I want to take a moment to thank both the council staff and the planning staff for their excellent work on this project. It's a lot of work. We understand that. I'm here to speak in favor of the IDO and also to express some concerns with a few of the proposed amendments. Similar to staff's presentations, I'm going to speak to items B, K, and R together. B, while I commend the goal of being more precise in regards to appeals, and I also applaud the idea of trying to match the appeals to the action that's being discussed and what that appropriate distance is, I think the table, which I think is important to that effort, actually, the way it is now, and this may be a carryover from the existing zoning code, actually adds some confusion to that. For example, archaeological certificates are identified as an administrative decision, yet they're really a supportive effort to a larger project, those projects greater than 5 acres, and they really should be discussed as part of the overall project itself. Also, preliminary versus final plats. Preliminary plats is really where the discussion takes place and the decision is made for all practical purposes, yet it's the final plat that is appealable. I think there's some confusion in there. Real quickly, with regards to K, I think that this amendment is too extreme and is not necessary. The IDO process for large retail facilities provides adequate opportunities for participation. C, I think you heard earlier I think there's some confusion adding non-recognized neighborhood associations. I think that just confuses the situation. And the West Side Amendment E, I think this actually could be counterproductive. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Strozier. Next is Lynn Anderson, followed by Mr. Perdomo, followed by Dr. Valles.
Good evening, President Benton, City Councilors. My name is Lynn Anderson. I'm representing NAIOP today, the Commercial Real Estate Development Association. I can echo a lot of what Jim said, but I will say that NAIOP thinks that if we have to choose, B is better than R. So the bottom line is it's a much more reasonable kind of approach, but we also agree that there are some things within that table that we would have concerns about, problems with, and questions about. In terms of E, I understand what's trying to be accomplished there. We agree that the jobs imbalance on the west side is something to be concerned about. But whenever you put this kind of restriction, you simply drive development elsewhere. And I think it would be counterproductive. I think it makes the west side non-competitive, frankly, certainly with moving across the very near border into Rio Rancho. And I would strongly recommend that we come up with an incentive kind of plan rather than a restrictive kind of approach to the problem. In essence, giving some sort of benefit for creating those commercial kind of properties. But I think they will be there themselves, but as has been pointed out, the logistics of the west side is often the problem, not whether it's a choice to do commercial or nothing at all. K is, I would agree, is one of the most restrictive, and we are concerned about it. A quarter mile has been what has previously been suggested for that. I think that is a realistic approach to it. We would recommend keeping the quarter mile. 50,000 square feet is almost not a big development anymore, so it also, I think, needs more discussion. But we would ask you to vote against it if for tonight. And finally, we'd just like to say, pass the IDO. We need it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next is Mr. Perdomo, followed by Dr. Valles, followed by Renee Horvath.
Good evening, councilors. My name is Sal Perdomo, and I'm with Titan Development. I also live in the Silver Hill Historic District, one block off of Central Avenue. I'm here to speak in support of the Integrated Development Ordinance. Regarding the proposed floor amendments, I ask that you vote against floor amendments K and R. These two amendments are injurious to our community because they give greater standing to those who want to delay and stop positive growth in our city. These amendments should be removed. Amendment C and E should be considered for removal as well. Additionally, I would like to present this petition in support of the approval of the Integrated Development Ordinance. This petition was signed by 352 people in this community. You should have received the results of this in your email this afternoon. I hope to send a list of actual names later on as well. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. I ask that you approve the Integrated Development Ordinance with the exception of amendments K, R, and E, and C. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Dr. Valles, followed by Ms. Horvath, followed by Simon Polakowski.
How you doing? Thank you. What happened to this plan being a simpler good for us in the community? What I saw a while ago was anything but. It was like sort of simpler but more complicated. And so that's a real problem. That's why people roll their eyes when they come to city council where they have these presentations. They don't get it. It takes a while. The Intercoalition panel went further than the West Side Coalition. We asked for a 6-month delay on this thing, which I think would be consistent with that notion that you all have, that you're going to have a 6-month grace period in which to change stuff. I'm not sure how much you can accomplish on that because we're just finding out things by amendment. You can tell by the amendments that have been presented to you, we're just finding out that there are still some things to be discovered and corrected. The Intercoalition panel holds that the Integrated Development Ordinance imposes severe restrictions on people's rights. We've talked about this a long time. And there's confirmation that planning staff from the very start intended to control neighborhoods, giving preferential or selective treatment to developers and see brainstorming session January 3rd, 2014. At the very front page, it says, keep neighborhoods under control, and that's repeated. And then under Consolidated Roundtable notes July 16th, 2013, it says, rebalancing neighborhood association input into the development process, too much power without responsibility. Need to either remove from the process or give them a charge. They can say no to a development only if they offer another area within the neighborhood where it would be more appropriate, or only allow them to say yes if require proof of representation of the neighborhood, at least one renter, one young family, et cetera, et cetera. I think that this is a big imposition on neighborhoods. I don't think this is ready, and I think it would be wise to get buy-in before it comes back to bite you in the butt. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Renee Horvath, followed by Simon Polakowski, followed by Eleanor Walter.
Good evening. My name is Renee Horvath. I'm with the Taylor Ranch Neighborhood Association. And I just want to point out, again, this is an overhaul of our current zone code. This is huge. This means a lot. Our current plans have been good. If there's some problems with it, then we could have fixed them. Our current plans have been very walkable friendly, have more protections in it for the neighborhoods, and given more rights to the neighborhoods than what you're getting with this IDO. In addition, this planning process has been very, very difficult. With this big overhaul, we've gone through 8 hearings in 8 months. This should not have been rushed as much as it has been. When the EPC was done, we had 54 findings and 321 conditions. And now you are looking at a ton of amendments that we have to keep track of. And over the weekend, we had to quickly look at these amendments and try to analyze them and understand them. And there are some that need to be revised. Some look promising, but we need, as neighborhoods, more time to do this. And I am glad that Dr. Valles brought up that this is not an easy document to read. This is harder than what we got. It's very difficult. And then on top of it, our big concerns with all the density that you're increasing building heights, taking away our sector plans, changing up our ordinances, and pushing this through so fast, it really loses the trust in government. And once those entitlements that we're doing, you will never be able to fix it. If the city decides they don't like it and you give them all those entitlements, they will not be able to fix it. On top of that, I am disturbed that with those strategy meetings, that it's like get the neighborhoods under control. Growth, no matter what.
Thank you.
So this really wasn't a fair process to begin
Thank you, Mr. Polakowski, Eleanor Walter, and then Mike Contreras.
Council President, Council, I speak for no one but myself. I'd like to remind people that realtors promised endless prosperity up to 2008. So this is part of the same people who belong to that gang. Also, right across the hall, we have the county treasurer here, where people informed by the county treasurer, by the way, would you like to look at this? This is what we're proposing to do in the future with properties in Albuquerque. Could have been done simply. Many people in Albuquerque still come in and pay in person their property taxes. Were they informed through the mail, through their property taxes, that there were going to be zoning changes to their property? Also, I've noticed that the people who I've met down here say the input, that there's been very little, if any, input on behalf of just everyday citizens. One man just mentioned 2 minutes in front of council. There needs to be some other forum where people can discuss these issues. Real estate, property owners, developers, and so on. This has not been discussed. This is what upset people. That's why people come down here. And again, the average person doesn't have the time to show up at 5 o'clock on a working day and come down and voice what their opinions and their problems. So the process is highly flawed. And as for planning, I lived on Buena Vista at one time, and city planning put in a bicycle cross-country covered Well, they put it in the wrong place, and now to alleviate the noise problem, they built a wall that I think Donald Trump would be envious of. Go up to Buena Vista and go look at the wall they had to build to cut down on the noise. It ruined the view. It's no longer really Buena Vista. It's something else. And again, one man said about medians, they got rid of all the medians. You can't turn left on Central because of art. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Eleanor Walther, followed by Mike Contreras, and then Debbie Bream, or Brem.
Can the document camera be on? How do we? Oh, okay. I can't. All right. My name's Eleanor Walther, and I'm president of the Rio Grande Boulevard Neighborhood Association. And I'd like to address parking in the IDO. My interest is in predominantly in cluster housing because that's what I've been working on. But if you'll notice, under the current zoning, 1.5 spaces were required for, it says apartments less than 1,000 square feet. Otherwise, it's 2 per bathroom. In the proposed IDO, that's 1 space for cottage development. I contend that that's not enough. If you look at the North Valley, it says orange, I think it's sort of yellowish, are the properties between 1 and 2 acres. And if you notice, most of these properties are long and narrow, and many of them abut against streets where there's no on-street parking. For instance, Rio Grande, Candelaria, on West Campbell, down by the bike path. So there's no on-street parking available. So if you only require 1 parking spot per unit, then there's going to be only parking for those residents, no one who comes to visit. So I propose that you take a look at it and increase it. I'd also like to talk about Amendment C. We appreciate Councilor Sanchez's effort to expand citizen engagement, and we like the neighborhood meetings idea. The other issue is that we'd like the neighborhoods to be notified on the minutes as well as it going into the application process.
Thank you. Next is Mr. Contreras, followed by Debbie Bream, followed by Paul Silverman.
Hi. Good evening, Council President Benton and members of the City Council. My name is Mike Contreras, Sentinel Real Estate and Investment, and I encourage you to pass the IDO with the exceptions of Amendment B, C, F, K, and R. And, you know, change is hard, period. And, but it, you know, change is necessary and long overdue. You know, the current zoning code and sector plans are way outdated, and we need to encourage growth in our community. And, you know, that's why the city spent millions of dollars and thousands and thousands of man hours preparing this document. And, you know, we didn't go through this process, you know, just, I think the city had a lot of foresight and wanting to change and make these necessary changes, and that have been long overdue. And we do need predictability, and that's what we've been lacking for a long time. And so I encourage you to pass the IDO. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Ms. Bream. I'm sorry if I'm messing up your name.
Nope. Okay. So, hi, Debbie Bream, President, members. Hi. I've never been here before, so I see everybody's
Welcome.
giving statements and no comebacks. Can we not ask questions?
It's normally not a give and take. It's an opportunity to comment.
Got it. Okay. So I represent the neighborhood, not the full neighborhood, but my immediate neighborhood in Bear Canyon, Academy, Wyoming. And we are strongly against the IDO, knowing what we know. We really would like to know why we weren't informed as a neighborhood. You know, we just found out about this. We didn't know your first meeting was in October, and is your decision going to be made by next Monday, the 13th? Is that the last time we can make a decision on this? I know it seems to be pushed through fairly quickly, kind of like somebody said earlier, just doesn't seem to be a fair process. And my question, which you're saying you can't really answer, but the IDO is for multifamily housing, which would include seniors and drug addicts, rehab homes. Is that correct? Do we know? You can't say?
There's an amendment that addresses that issue, yes.
Okay. Well, that's our biggest concern. I mean, we're all getting older, we're all aging, seniors aren't the problem. But you bring rehab homes into our neighborhoods, there's gonna be a problem. We already have a problem with crime. And I have firsthand in that, helping a young one who was an addict. So just sending them to rehab once isn't gonna fix it. Sending them 20 times isn't gonna fix it. So you've moved them into a neighborhood that they can now have plenty to steal from. I just want you to please consider to defer this decision. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Harris has a comment.
Yes, and this is not a question, but could you give your phone number to these ladies up here and they can talk to you? I think the chances of there being drug houses and high-rise apartments in Bear Canyon are pretty infinitesimal.
Thank you.
But anyway,
That's what we want to hear.
if you could talk to staff, I think there's just a lot of misunderstanding about this process and about the ordinance.
I appreciate it.
Sure.
Next speaker is Paul Silverman, then Esther Escobedo, and then Jaime Jaramillo.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank the council and the staff for all the 2 years of hard work, the over $2 million worth of investment that we put into creating this document. And I want to repeat something that was said by our consultant on this project at the very first meeting over 2 years ago, and that is that he had done this job 52 times in 52 different cities, and Albuquerque's planning and zoning processes were the worst that he'd ever seen out of 52 other cities. So this document is more than needed. It's absolutely imperative if we want to move our city forward. It's been way overdue, and it's something that absolutely needs to be done. I am an ardent supporter of the IDO. We need it. We need it now. There's always those people that say, well, let's just put it off, let's put it off, let's put it off. And if we're ever going to move forward, we can't do that. I want to call particular attention to amendments B, C, E, K, and R, with particular emphasis on K and R. The industry participated wholeheartedly in this endeavor. We agreed that maybe more education on the front end might be valuable to be able to reach harmony on the back end. But if we don't get rid of at least K&R, we might as well not do anything, because I can tell you as the poster boy for being appealed, it's no fun, it has no value in it, and it's harmful in terms of how the world thinks about how we make our city better. So I want to implore you to get rid of K&R at a minimum, and please don't pass B, C, or E.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So next is Esther Escobedo, Mr. Jaramillo, and then Covinda Haynes.
Hi, Council President and councilors. My name is Esther Escobedo. I am a lifelong resident of Martineztown. My family is the founder of Martineztown. I do want it to remain residential commercial. I feel that all my neighbors do not have any of this information. We have our neighborhood association President, Loretta Naranjo Lopez, and then we have Semillas y Raíces. But our neighbors, the people that live there, are not aware of this. I would like for it to be deferred so that everyone has a voice in it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Mr. Jaramillo, Jaime Jaramillo, or Ms. Jaramillo, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Jamie.
Yes.
Not Jaime.
I answer to
Okay.
both.
Welcome.
Thank you. Mr. President, councilors, my name is Jamie Jaramillo, and I'm with Consensus Planning. I would like to express my deep gratitude and support for the IDO and gratitude for city planning staff, council staff, and you all, the councilors, for listening to our specific concerns and incorporating them via amendments into the IDO. Generally, we support amendments L and N, which we believe will make the process more flexible as it relates to the PD zone lot size and expedited IDO changes after the adoption. We are also opposed to amendments B, C, E, K, and R, as these proposals will have major repercussions on the development process, economic development in general, and in some cases do not incorporate best practices or clear language. We also support Amendment F, which largely makes existing manufacturing development fit better within the confines of zoning in general and our specific city IDO related to expansions, parking, and separation of uses. Amendment F is the product of the City Council and staff's continued willingness and to keep an open door policy and to proceed with the IDO as a living draft. Thank you again to those working to improve the day-to-day process and balance the interests of residents, neighbors, and developers. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Govinda Haynes, followed by Veronica Salinas, followed by Ron Bohannon.
Good evening. I'm here to speak about building heights and commercial building heights in Highland. And this regards the building heights as amended from the LUPS committee. So the current zoning shown in green, the proposed IDO zoning is shown in red. The bottom line is, and this shows a 32-degree angle plane that protects 1 hour of solar access on winter solstice. So the bottom line is the old zoning green did not impinge on the solar access of the residential community to the north. The current zoning does, and it's all due to the increased 20 feet from the current zone, or the proposed zoning. So I do appreciate the 50-foot setback. That definitely made the situation a lot better. And so I provided this information to council, staff, and planning, and they reviewed it and basically sent me an email confirming that the math is correct. But they can contend that blocking the south-facing walls of the residential is not a problem. So in the Solar Rights Act of New Mexico, it basically effectively grants solar rights to anyone who puts a solar collector to beneficial use. A solar collector is defined as sun through windows and walls, and so I would contend that these windows and these walls on the south-facing wall of these residential properties was put into use in the 50s. Thank you. Oh, I can continue to talk. So I guess that's it. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you. And yeah, we will discuss that some more tonight. Next is Veronica Salinas, followed by Ron Bohannon, then Elizabeth Venzel.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. So first off, I'm going to talk about Amendment J, but I'd like to thank Pat Davis and the planning staff for listening to neighborhood feedback on Amendment J, which is the walls and fences in the front yard setback. It's a good compromise, but I really think that we could do much better. When a public policy, and the reason why is because when a public policy is implemented, presumably for the benefit of the public, it should be the default. So in other words, residents should be required to opt out, not opt in. This is because it would reach the maximum number of residents when you have to opt out. So for example, using Amendment J, let us engage in a very brief thought exercise. So imagine for a moment that every neighborhood and every residential property in Albuquerque has a wall over 6 feet in the front yard setback. What would that look like? A city of walls, a prison. I think that the streetscape would look like concrete. There would be no eyes on the street, which would in turn increase crime. And so I think that few would argue that this would be a desirable place to live. Now imagine that there are no walls over 3 feet in the front yard setback in Albuquerque, anywhere. What would that look like? Properties on streets with heavy traffic would have to grow more greenery, plants and trees in order to buffer themselves from the traffic. Other than that, what are the downsides? There would be open streetscapes, eyes on the street, which would decrease crime. There would be visible historic architecture, more green. So which is preferable? I'm arguing that it's the latter. This is why policies should be the default with options for neighborhoods to opt out. And this could also be applied to solar rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Mr. Bohannon, then Ms. Vensil, then Eric Jeffries.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ron Bohannon. I'd like to point out that this has been ongoing since March of 2014. I'm here in support of the IDO. I've been in business for 32 years, and in development for 37 years. So if I do the math right, that's 9 mayors and as many councils. Over the past few weeks, my staff, as we get new projects come in, we've been evaluating the existing zoning versus the IDO zoning, and we've been looking at both of those. And my staff today finally came and they said, we get it. We finally get the IDO. And what that does is when you look at different parts of towns, you have layers and layers and layers of plans. And what this IDO is doing is taking away and making it predictable, giving the protection to the neighbors, doing everything that everybody's been saying. We can get up here and we can keep hammering away on the IDO, but the citizens of Albuquerque have elected you guys to lead us down this path, and I am one and confident in you guys. It's going to be a rocky road. There are some really tough decisions to make, but I trust you guys to make the right decisions. I can get up here and say, I don't want to believe in all these other amendments on standing. I probably have been appealed more than any other individual in this room. I have opposed and been supported by many of these associations that are behind me. But I trust you guys. You guys have the knowledge and the ability to make the right decisions. It won't be perfect, but it'll be a step forward. And trust me, I'm going to enforce the rules no matter what you do. If you don't pass it, I'm going to keep doing the same thing I've been doing for 37 years. Thank you very much. I urge your support.
Thank you. Next is Ms. Vensil, followed by Mr. Jeffries, and then Marianne Barlow.
Thank you. Good evening. I am concerned about the lack of involvement with this process. I have a specific personal example. I'm very concerned about the business heights, the building heights that are being proposed in the IDO. Special concessions were made to my sister neighborhoods in Nob Hill to maintain the building heights. And our neighborhood was not given that. And there is no justification for that in my mind. At the last hearing I spoke, it was said that there were some developers that are interested in our area. I submitted amendments to correct our sections so that we would be treated the same, and I received no response. I then reached out to the planning staff because I had known the West Side had study sessions, and I hear you talking about study sessions. But those are a ruse. Those are given arbitrarily. Because when I ask for a study session, for example, I'd like to know, since a lot of this is not in writing, there was a mistake in my area. We're zone CCR3. We are not C3. And the planning staff, because they're young, and they haven't been around as much as some of us old farts here that are talking, they thought that meant C3. So they zoned us MXH. The IDO says we're MXH. I brought that up, and I was told it was corrected. But I have not seen that in writing. So when I asked for a study session, my counselor in District 6 wrote an email and said, sorry, we can't meet with you. I didn't even ask him. I asked them. So when do I get my fair chance to ask these questions and have them answered? We don't have an old funky sector plan in our neighborhood. Ours is from 2014. And it's obvious when you set your next meeting just before the mayoral election, this is getting slipped through. It's suspicious, and we see you.
Thank you. Next is let's see, Mr. Davis, Councilor Davis would like to reply. Okay. Mr. Jeffries, Eric Jeffries, followed by Mary Ann Barlow.
My name's Eric Jeffries, Chairman, Councilors. I'll be very short. I don't think it's a legitimate objection that a complex zoning problem has complex zoning coordinates and language like you have before you. It's a complex issue, and of course, what you resulted with was a complex litigation. And I frankly think that you're making progress. I support it. And I support the comments that were made by Jim Strozier of Consensus Planning. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Barlow, and then Jolene Wolfley.
Thank you, councilors, for hearing us. Mary Ann Barlow, representative of Lawless Landowners Association. And I'm just here to say that that I and a lot of my neighbors feel really manipulated by this process. It has seemed from the beginning like this was a plan by the administration to really push through development without serious consideration of the neighborhoods involved. The size of this ABZ plan and the IDO is designed to discourage all but developers and those very, very few people who have time to wade through both documents to try to see where everything goes and to figure it out. And frankly, I don't know too many people who are really able to do this and make a reasonable comment on these plans, which is not representative for the neighborhoods. And we really deeply resent this. Tonight I heard amendment after amendment after amendment saying, well, we need this one, we don't need this one, we need further ones here, we need further ones here. And I've been to several of these meetings, and this has gone on and on and on with different amendments and different plans. And I think that I think this needs to be deferred. There's some really good parts of this plan. We're not totally against the plan, but we feel that it really needs to be deferred until another administration comes in. We can look at it with fresh eyes and say, okay, this is good. These neighborhoods need to have some kind of condensation of this plan so we understand it. Thank you for your consideration.
Next speaker is Jolene Wolfley.
Council President Benton and members of the City Council. I just returned from Phoenix, and Phoenix has not updated their zoning code in decades. They have robust growth. They have skyscrapers that have grown over the 20 years since I left there as a city planner. They have millennials all over the place. So there's a direct correlation between updating your zoning code and economic development. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do the IDO, we should, but there are several places that we need to get right. And one affects 25% of our city. It's the SU1 zoning. So when you have an SU1 parcel, the site plan establishes your zoning. And it can also establish design guidelines. There's a facilitated meeting in that process, and there's an EPC hearing. And if you want to change anything with your zoning, you have to go through an EPC hearing as well. So we have 2,000 parcels in the city with that zoning, 25% of our acreage. The IDO would convert them all to straight zoning where they could be developed without a hearing. I've submitted you materials last Thursday with attorney Timothy Flynn O'Brien, who did a legal opinion for us back in May that said this isn't legal. One of the other problems in the IDO is a premise that in land use policy, we can't have policy anymore. We can only have regulation. I spoke with one of my colleagues in Phoenix who's done zoning work there for 30 years. I said, would you think that every design, the issue of design in your city, not getting any old O'Reillys, but the best O'Reillys you can get, can you do that all with black and white? And he said, there's no way. You
Thank
need
you.
to have policy as well as zoning.
Thank you, Ms. Wolfley. Time's up.
Mr. President,
All right, Councilor
I have one
Sanchez.
question for staff regarding the special use zoning that we currently have in place now. And I think Jolene mentioned there was over 2,000 SU permits that have been issued. When somebody comes in for an SU permit, do they not have to go through certain conditions to be allowed that development?
Mr. President, Councilor Sanchez, yes, the SU1 zone site plans that are approved today will remain in place. And so anyone coming in to develop those parcels will need to still follow those site plans. And any site plans that are adjacent to certain areas like major public open space will also still have to go through additional processes associated with those.
So are we going to have any legal issues regarding special use permits with the adoption of the IDO?
It is our understanding that no, we won't, that this is a legislative process. And so it's a citywide conversion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jolene?
I would just mention that
Well, was there a question for Ms.
Well, I'd like to follow up with the statements made by the staff for Jolene to just kind of reiterate, but just to keep it very brief.
Okay.
So Ms. Morris talked about that you can keep your site plan in place and follow those regulations, or you can choose to have your straight zoning that you were converted to, and then you don't have to follow your old site plan and you don't have to have any public hearing on a new site plan. So it is very different, and that's where you have the legal challenge. If you keep your old site plan, but the fact that you literally, on that zoning map, you are converting to new zones that are straight zoning that allow you to drop your old site plan and pick up a new site plan that just goes through staff. And the likelihood of that happening is very high because you may not like all the restrictions on your site plan. You may like the freedom and the upzoning that is allowed, that this zoning conversion map will give to you.
Mr. President, I'd like to get clarification from staff or from our legal staff regarding this issue.
Mr. Melendres?
Thank you, Mr. President, Council. We have seen the material that Ms. Wolfley referenced that was submitted. Certainly it's from an advocacy perspective from this particular group on the west side. Staff has explained it correctly that the way that the conversion will happen is that you can continue to proceed under your SU1 zoning or under your converted zone. Certainly, folks in the west side folks have taken issue with that. However, we believe that that process is appropriately done in the city, where we are doing it through this broad legislative process, as mentioned by Ms. Morris, through policies that are intended to implement a comprehensive citywide rezoning for the purpose of providing more straight zoning and more predictability.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that concludes the public comment. And we are now going to go back to the hearing with Ms. Renz Whitmore from Planning is going to come up and address the West Side Coalition Neighborhood Association's press release of today.
Mr. President, councilors, the project team has discussed with all stakeholders for the last 3 years that our system today relies heavily on neighborhood associations negotiating for quality standards and neighborhood protections through special use zones at the Planning Commission, at least for the half of the city that has SU1 or SU2 zones. As we have seen, this system is highly inequitable, relying on the time and attention of those neighborhoods who can be involved full-time with development decisions. The other half of the city has to live with rules from our 1970 zoning code without good protections or notice requirements. The IDO rebalances the system so that the quality standards for neighborhood protections are written into the IDO as requirements that don't have to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. These increased standards allow more development review by staff and less review by discretionary decision makers. The IDO also moves the negotiations between developers and neighbors to happen before an application can be submitted to the city. These conversations, collaborative conversations, can include items important to neighbors that go beyond what the city can require of a development. The IDO includes more notice to neighbor associations, not less, more protections citywide through neighborhood edges, flavors of R1, building design standards, and development standards near major public open space. More long-range planning opportunities for all neighborhood associations citywide through the community planning area assessment process, not just for those with sector development plans, some of which have never been updated, and the majority of which are over 10 years old. There is no question that this is an overhaul of our existing system, not for nefarious or cynical purposes, but to follow best practices for a more transparent, more predictable, more equitable, and more efficient land use and zoning framework for development and for community planning.
So, Ms. Renz-Whitmore, I'll just go ahead and ask, since it was part of the press release, and I think all the councilors have probably seen that. It has been entered into the record. But the idea of early staff brainstorming sessions where there was discussion about a perception, perhaps, that neighborhood empowerment had gone too far. I just want to go ahead and get that right out there and have you respond to that.
Sure. So the neighborhood associations are powerful allies to the planning department in helping us to make sure that good development happens in Albuquerque. The IDO proposes to rebalance their input earlier in the process, in the development process, through the required neighborhood meetings. It still provides adequate opportunities for those larger decisions to go through meetings and public hearings, still allows the opportunity for anyone who's been harmed to appeal any decision, and for those neighborhood associations within a certain distance to appeal those decisions based on the tables that are before you for those amendments. So there's no nefarious purpose to control neighborhood associations at this point. Now it's about how do we move together, planning department, neighborhood associations, developers, all stakeholders, to get better development in Albuquerque.
Thank you. And you know, I share your dependence on neighborhood associations.
Absolutely.
Because it's very important to me to have strong neighborhood associations. I wanted to ask about, with regard, maybe this is just getting into the amendments, and maybe I should just let it go for later, because this has to do with the amendments having to do with standing. But as I understand it, very few municipalities give this geographic automatic standing based on geography or distance.
That is correct. From the cities that, Mr. President, other councilors, from the cities that we've looked at, no other codes that we've found have a provision where someone who's appealing a decision doesn't have to show harm. That we are the only ones that we could find that actually provide automatic standing through proximity, whether for neighborhood associations or for property owners with a certain distance. So we're already far on the side of being generous in terms of granting that automatic standing. And now the question is how much is good best practice planning?
Yeah, so just to be clear, those amendments that we're going to discuss maintain these proximity standards. And when it was explained to me that way, I have to say I was sort of taken aback, having worked with the system all these years. I never thought of it that way, that well, I could have no harm. I could have no responsibility of demonstrating harm to me, yet I would be, if I'm close enough, I can be given legal standing. Any other questions for Ms. Rens-Whitmore?
Thank you, Mr. President. Going back to the Consolidated Roundtable meeting on July 16th of 2013, I was concerned when I read that some of the statements, it says rebalancing neighborhood associations' input into the development process, too much power without responsibility. Need to either remove from process or give them a charge. You know, the neighborhood associations have been involved with many of the developments for many, many decades in this community. And I'm particularly concerned by some of the statements that were made. I'm not sure who made the statement when this meeting took place, but it troubles me to see that, you know, there's disrespect for a lot of the work that has been done over the decades by our neighborhood associations. And this goes back to 2013. I've not heard that statement again after that, but I just feel that we must respect the work that has been done over the years. I mean, the sector plans have withstood the test of time for a lot of years. And I know that we're changing and we need to look at some changes, you know, in the development process, because I know that there are some cumbersome problems within that development. But this really concerns me regarding some of the comments that were made. And I think it's extremely troubling that it really puts into question, you know, what was the reason for moving forward with this IDO to exclude neighborhood associations. I would hope that would not be the case.
Mr. President, Councilor, I think you can see in the draft itself that neighborhood associations are an important part of the development process through the required neighborhood meetings, through additional notice that's beyond what's granted today, through those facilitated meetings that are still brought forward that anyone can request, and through the public meetings and hearings for the different development decisions that are larger and more complicated, where we understand that those implications actually, and the decisions get better with neighborhood input, which is why they're still part of a process in the IDO.
I would just say, you know, as a co-sponsor, there was never any discussion that I was part of. I mean, there might have been some staff discussions about these, and you know, when staff is sitting around at a brainstorming roundtable, people are allowed and encouraged to say all sorts of things. But certainly the concept that somehow some staff, including, you know, fairly low-level staff, were directing this effort is not accurate to my knowledge. So, anyway, that's that. Councilor Winter, Vice President.
Yeah, I just got a comment before we start voting on the amendments, and I know some of us have been doing this a long, long time, and we've worked with land use for all the years that we've been on this council. And there's always been this tension a little bit between neighborhoods and developers, and not a whole lot of trust. And I think it's our job as the council is to make sure that we are fair to the point that we want to encourage growth. We want to have the opportunity to grow, and yet we still have our neighborhood folks that we have to be fair with. And so it's kind of tough. It's a tough decision for us to do. But I think one thing that I've noticed when up in my district with some of the growth there is some of the sector plans were pretty good, and a lot of the developers really worked on the front side with the neighborhoods to really work together cohesively to have some really good growth. And especially on that Paseo del Norte North Quarter, it is great. And that's what I would hope, that however we go with this, that we get that working together with everybody to create the growth that we need. So just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Winter. All right, we'll move on to discussion of these bills and the amendments that we've heard so much about. I was going to go ahead and move a due pass on Committee Substitute 049 just to get started.
May I, Mr. President, may I just make one request before we get started on these? And that is, I know we have a lot of city department heads and people in different departments in the city, and I'd just like to see, because they're the ones who have to make this thing work. The department heads, the planners, every piece of the city has to make it work. Would the department heads who are in favor of the IDO or their employees or all of the above, please stand up if you're here. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Just to let you know, these are the people who have to deal with this also. So it's kind of nice to know that they are appreciating something new also. Thank you.
There's a motion and a second, motion for a due pass on Committee Substitute 049. Is there a second? There's a second. We'll tackle this packet of amendments, and I want to say that anything of this magnitude is going, I hope, would be amended numerous times before it sees the light of day, as is this situation with our entire zoning ordinance and development regulations. But so we do have we'll just start with the amendments in the order of the packet. And the first one is Amendment A for residential development. And we did have our summary on these from staff, but we're certainly open to any further discussion on any of these. But this is Amendment A. This would be Amendment number 1 if passed, and this is sponsored by Councilor Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to move amendment referred to as A for this amendment proposes to make several changes to residential development standards and definitions.
Excuse me. Is there any discussion on this? Just could you summarize it briefly, if you don't mind, Councilor? This was the, I believe, had greatly to do with the campground use.
Right. This one was before you last time we met. However, we took out something that really did not fit very well. Actually, two things: artisan manufacturing, put that in its own amendment, as well as minimum acreage for a planned development zone.
Okay.
So it remains on this amendment are references to a campground, both the size and overall density. So the minimum project size for a campground or recreational vehicle park would go from 5 to 1 acre, and the gross density within that campground would be 25 campsites per acre. Then there's some language changes, changing the name of campground to campground recreational vehicle park, and then revising the definition for campground RV park as well. Let's see.
Okay. Councilors, any discussion on the amendment?
Mr. President, briefly for our staff or for the sponsor, if I could just ask, how does the site size requirement from 5 to 1 acre compare with other cities or other places where we've looked at this? And can you clarify for me, it's my understanding that although this might make these RV parks permissive in future, any new future use for this would still have to go through a public hearing according to our public hearing requirements. So this is not automatic. Is that correct?
Mr. President, Councilor Davis, that is correct. This would apply to all new campground requests, and campgrounds today are an SU1 zone request, so that means you have to have a site plan and a zone change required, and that process carries over. Campgrounds would be a non-residential special use zone in the future. And so all future campgrounds would require a hearing and an approved site plan with it. The size, we did not compare this with other sizes in other cities, but in general, campsites do vary from place to place and setting to setting.
Thank you.
All right, there's a motion and a second for floor amendment number 1, which is labeled A. Any further discussion or questions? All those in favor say yes. Yes. Opposed? And that passes. Next is item B. We're going to be considering item B. This is the standing, and this did proceed, of course, in its introduction to the competing amendment. But we want to have a discussion now about item B, which would be floor amendment number 2. And this has to do with standing. The version B, which is sponsored by myself and Councilor Gibson, is, as was described by staff, based on the impact of the decision that is being made and the breadth, I would say, of the decision that is in question, and bases the standing distance on that. So more monumental, I guess maybe you could give us examples on the higher and lower end of that, if you don't mind, Ms. Moore or Ms. Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. President. For the most part, if you are a neighborhood association, the proposed development would need to be within or adjacent to your boundary to have automatic standing. For minor decisions, as an individual or a property owner, rather, you'd need to be within 100 feet or 330 feet if the decision is determined to be major. As compared with the table that is in Amendment R, which would keep distance requirements as they are today for the most part, which is, for the most part, either 330 or 660 feet for everything. Or, I'm sorry, 300 and 600 feet for everything.
Thank you. And then, so things like the infamous archaeological certificate that Mr. Strozier was talking about is considered a fairly limited decision, and that requires the neighborhood to either be directly adjacent to the site, or within or that the site be within the neighborhood's boundaries. And then for property owners, you would have to be within at least 100 feet of the site. As an example, on the larger side, these would be especially decisions requiring a public hearing, for instance, or things that are considered to be more controversial, like a wireless telecommunication facility. These are the respective distances. You can be within 660 feet if you're a neighborhood association, or within 330 feet if you are a property owner. So that's kind of the example of the way this table deals with distance. And then we probably should have, as a discussion, because we're looking at these as essentially competing amendments, is Councilor Sanchez's Amendment R, and I'll leave it to Councilor Sanchez to explain that, but or staff, if you wish.
Go ahead, and then I'll proceed.
Sure, Mr. President, Councilor Sanchez. You can compare the table in Amendment B with the table in Amendment R, which essentially sets out 300 feet for a property owner and 600 feet for a neighborhood association across the board. It paints a much broader brush and doesn't kind of nuance or parse out that one decision may have more impact than another, which is how today's code operates.
All right.
And Mr. President, this amendment proposes to revise the distance requirements of the property owner or registered neighborhood association to be considered to have standing in an appeal. This amendment proposes distance that reflects the current zoning code today. And I just feel that the current zoning code that we have today regarding appeals has worked and has worked well. You know, we don't get that many appeals. I know Mr. Bohannon made the comment that he's probably been appealed more than anyone else. But I feel overall that the system has worked well over the years. And I would just like to continue to try to incorporate and involve the neighborhood associations. If they feel that there is a case where they should have an opportunity to appeal, they should have every opportunity to do so. And I don't think we see a lot of appeals that come through that don't have standing. I'm sure there has been some, but I just feel the process in the past has worked, and I'd like to continue to utilize the same zoning code that we have today.
Thank you. And I neglected to see how far we've gotten on into the night, so I think we do need to take a dinner break at this point, and then we'll come back and continue. Councilor Jones.
Thank you. And if the staff could answer a question, doesn't everyone have the right to appeal if they feel that they are harmed, and if they can prove that they are harmed, they have standing at that point?
Mr. President, Councilor Jones, yes, that's a provision that exists in today's zoning code, and that would carry over as what we call kind of a catch-all provision, that if you can prove that you have been harmed, these standing requirements don't even matter.
So, and that can be anywhere. That can be somebody who lives or owns property in the northeast, and the development or whatever's coming in is in the southwest, anywhere in the city. They have to be restricted to the city.
Mr. President, Councilor Jones, that's correct.
Okay, so the only requirement to file an appeal is to have $50?
I'm not sure what the cost of an appeal is.
$50 and to live in the city. So I think that's a pretty good opportunity for anybody who wants to appeal in and is truly harmed to have standing and make that happen. So I think, personally, I think B is a very good compromise.
All right, so we'll continue the discussion on Amendment B and Amendment R after the dinner break.